amid a projection by the federal government to spend a whopping sum of 6.7 trillion naira on fuel subsidy next year and a major shortfall in government's oil revenue this year, tougher days are certainly ahead for the economy. States and, of course, citizens, as projected revenue by the government falls by 1.89 trillion naira. It will be recalled that the Minister of Finance, Mrs. Zanab Ahmed, during a public presentation of the 2023 to 2025 Medium Term Expenditure Framework on Thursday, disclosed that crude oil production challenges and PMS subsidy deductions by NNPC has continued to constitute significant threat to the achievement of the government's revenue growth targets, as seen in the 2022 budget performance. The minister, however, noted that the gross oil and gas federation revenue for the first 4 months of 2022 failed to meet the expected target, falling from 303.12 trillion naira to 1.23 trillion naira, representing a 39% performance despite high oil prices. Well, you may want to ask, in what way will this development affect businesses, citizens, and of course, economy at large? Well, that's the question, and let's try to get answers to this. I'm being joined again via Zoom by an investment research analyst. He works with United Capital PLC, Mr. Ayorinde Akinloye. Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Akinloye. It's good to see you.
Thank you very much for having me on the show, Tolu. It's always a pleasure to be on. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first, a lot of issues in that document presented by the Minister of Finance, looking at the mid-year reports and all of that. But first, I want us to talk about this revenue shortage issue. We're actually short of revenue, and we are even using more to service debt. What does this mean for a country like Nigeria? An overview of that paper from your end.
Okay, so quickly, I think I'll just delve into the context of the revenue shortage and the expenditure side. So I'll just quickly take that as quick as possible. So first, let's look at the revenue part, right? So first, in the 2022 budget, the federal government set out to make roughly about between 9 to 10 trillion for 2022. For the whole budget year. And based on the documents that was released from the Ministry of Finance, that is covering the performance between January to April, they budgeted to make around 3.3 trillion. That was the plan. That was what they had in plan. When you prorate the about 9-10 trillion that they intended to make for the year, for January to April, that will come to about 3.3 trillion. But the actual figures, right, in terms of actual revenue generation for that period, was a little under 1.7 trillion, about 1.63 trillion, thereabout. That was what they were able to make. And that represents a significant underperformance. That's literally achieving just about 50% of what they actually set out to make in that period. And that's a significant concern, right? Because when you contrast that with the expenditure side, so in that same period, between January to April, the federal government was looking at expending about 5.7 trillion, about 5.77 trillion in total between January and April. And they spent about 4.72 trillion. That's roughly about 82%, right? So first, you look at the context of even before underperforming revenues, the federal government was already having a huge deficit to cover. And now revenues are underperforming. And on the other hand, expenditure, they are spending, pretty much close to what they intended to spend for that period, which is a significant concern, right? So for the first thing to look at is, why are we experiencing revenue shortages? Why are we even seeing these shortages happen? If you look at all the different sources of revenue for the federal government, from oil revenue to taxes to independent revenue, independent revenue makes, contains, interest on government funds, on dividends for shares that government own in different companies and things like that. When you look at the revenue lines, the different revenue lines for the federal government, you would observe that the two key drawbacks, the two key lines that sort of made the federal government unable to achieve their revenue targets were: one, oil revenue; two, and the independent revenue component. Now, oil revenue performance, they underperformed by about 60%, meaning federal government only achieved about 40% of what intended to earn in oil revenue. And the question on the mind of a lot of Nigerians in the public spaces: crude oil prices jumped as high as $110, $120 per barrel. how come we are facing these shortages? The big problem for us is oil production. Historically, Nigeria would always produce between 1.9 to 2 million barrels of crude oil per day. But when you look at that budget, the budget document, our average production for that period was just about 1.39 million barrels per day that we produced for that period. So you can see the significant underperformance. Mind you, we are an economy that subsidizes the cost of petrol for the populace. So not only have we lost in terms of our crude oil production, we are also losing quite a bit to subsidy payments that we have had to make, in order to keep the price of petrol affordable for the populace. And that subsidy payment has had to increase significantly. Let me just to give a bit of context to this so that we can understand, right? So we are producing roughly about 1.4 million barrels per day, and we import. So Nigeria's petrol consumption is anywhere between 400 to 500,000 barrels per day. But the problem is the cost of importing 1 barrel of petrol is roughly around $170 to import 1 barrel of petrol. And we make about $210, $115 for every barrel of crude oil that we sell. That is before we deduct the drilling expenses in the crude oil production, and that is before other IOCs who are partners with the federal government deduct their share of revenue. So for every revenue we earn from crude oil production, federal government would only own about maybe 50% of that, depending on the percentage held by, the IOCs and other domestic oil firms, the likes of Seplat, the likes of ExxonMobil, the likes of Shell, who are joint venture partners with the federal government. So what is left for the government after they pay subsidies, after they deduct expense for drilling, is almost nothing. So we can see why our oil revenue really underperformed within that period. And this is a significant headache for the federal government today as it stands, which is why we saw the marginal increase in price of petrol recently in order to sort of alleviate a bit of that burden from the federal government. So that's where we are on revenue shortages. The fact that we are underperforming significantly on our crude oil earnings is a significant headache for the federal government. And also the independent revenue sources who are not doing well. And if you also see revenues from other agencies, on the tax side, we are doing pretty much okay. VAT and CIT targets, they basically met their targets at, above 90%, very close to 100%. But earnings from customs, that's custom duties, when you include import duties, excise duties, and things like that, he underperformed by about 24%. So these are all critical places where there are loopholes that the federal government will be looking at filling in order to ensure that they are able to get their finances in proper position before the end of the year. On the expenditure side, we are expanding significantly. Like you mentioned earlier, our debt service cost today is more than the revenue we generate. So between January and April, we generated revenue of about 1.63 trillion. On our debt service, that's the debt service cost, we spent about 1.9 trillion thereabouts. So our debt service cost is now our debt service to revenue is about 119%, which is a significant problem again for the federal government, which is why you can understand when the finance minister is lamenting and complaining that the federal government is significantly pressured. So we are facing two problems: revenue shortages, and we are sort of spending beyond our means. And it's something that the federal government, would have to pay significant attention to in order to get the house together when it comes to fiscal policy.
Great stuff. You answered two questions there in one. Perfect there. But let's move on to investment. You are an investment research analyst. And a country like Nigeria, with all of the insecurity we face and all those challenges, of course, that would affect the performance of the budget, we're still looking at investments. But with all of this that we face, foreign exchange issues, domestic challenges, and insecurity, many are saying that we could see a drag down in investment. What does that mean for Nigeria as we project ahead of 2023?
Well, basically looking forward, it's still a sort of concerning state, because for us to sort of alleviate the current pressures that we are facing, right? First thing is we need to get oil production back to where it used to be. But like you mentioned, insecurity is a big challenge that has hindered this. So we're having lots of crude oil theft. pipeline vandalism. So, crude oil theft at source, even pipeline vandalism when the oil is the oil that's been extracted is going through the pipelines and through the export terminal. So we are facing these insecurity issues on that front. And that is a key limiter that's a key limiting factor, a key constraint, limiting our ability to scale our crude oil production back to the levels where they used to be. One. Two is, as long as if we are going to continue to operate within the 1.4 million barrels per day crude oil production, it means we can no longer afford as a country to continue to pay subsidies. However, the question is the federal government willing to bite that bullet now, particularly as we're in a pre-election year? We don't think that is likely going to happen, right? So that is, again, another thing to factor in when we are projecting for the rest of the year. Now, like you mentioned, there are so many challenges within the economy, infrastructure, in terms of insecurity. We need to fund the military, we need to fund the police, we need to buy weapons, we need to invest in social infrastructure to get young people off the streets and not make them available for terrorist activities. We need to invest in infrastructure in order to ensure that sectors like agric are doing well, our port infrastructure is working functionally, and we have proper investments in place that would show investors and foreign investors that we mean business. But the truth is, all these things are going to cost a lot of money. And the question is, do we have the capacity to expend this? Do we have the capacity to generate enough revenue to cover all this expenditure that we need to make? Yes, potentially we have. But in terms of realistically, over the next 6 months, for the final 6 or 5 months of the year, the truth is, it's going to be difficult for us to scale our revenue from where we are right now to where we need to be in order to cover all the funding we need in all these kind of investments. I'll give you an example, right? We are saying that one of the justifications for the aggressive borrowing stance or the aggressive borrowing tilt of the current fiscal administration is the need for them to invest in capital projects, right, in infrastructure and things like that. But when you look at the budget performance, when you analyze the budget performance between January and April, the budget deficit was about 3 trillion, which means the federal government borrowed roughly around 3 trillion within that period. But if you look at the amount expended on capital expenditure, it was less than 1 trillion. It was just about 770 billion. So when you take 770 billion as a percentage of the 3 trillion that the federal government had borrowed within that period, we are talking about spending just 25% of what was borrowed on infrastructure. So we are clearly
All right, I think we'll try to reconnect with Ayo there. Now, of course, Ayo, are you there?
I'm here. I can hear you clearly.
Go ahead. You were trying to land there. We had some issues with the audio.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
I think it was network or something.
Okay. Yeah. So, the point I was just trying to make was the fact that there's a lot of expenditure that needs to be done in order to get our infrastructure and the economy to where we need the economy to be, right? But the truth is, for now, we don't have the revenue capacity to be able to get these things where they should be, right? And like I mentioned earlier, even borrowing will not get us out of these issues, right? Because we are when you look at the borrowing plan of the federal government, that what they executed between January and April, only about 25% of borrowed funds went to capital projects. So that's a significant concern to look at for. So the truth is, we can't continue to run this kind of robust government. And what we need to look at doing is to see how the federal government will become an enabler to allow foreign investors, to allow domestic investors raise the needed capital to expand on some of these key infrastructure projects that would drive economic growth, improve businesses, and improve the general operating environment. Otherwise, the federal government will just be carrying too much load on itself, and it won't be able to push through a lot of this agenda.
Well, interesting. I don't know if you can do this in 1 minute, but worst case scenario, what could happen if we continue at this pace? Let's wrap up on that note.
I wouldn't like to be extremely pessimistic to say, to be the prophet of doom, right?
Yeah,
but
I understand.
I think we're definitely on the path. We are definitely following a path where the federal government could become significantly pressured to even be able to pay to service debts going forward. At this point in time, right, we are not generating enough revenues to service our debts. When these debts begin to mature, when we have to pay back the principal on these debts, would we have enough cash flow to be able to pay back this principal? Yes, in Naira debts, you can easily just print more Naira and, pay back all the debt holders. But the truth is, the ripple effect of that is inflation, is, making the Naira more and more lose value compared to where it is today. So going forward, the outlook is still very much bleak. We still expect the federal government to continue to service the humongous debts, and they will continue to borrow more. And what that means is we are really heading on the path. This strategy of aggressive fiscal spend is going to place us in very critical negative position in years to come. And it's one that we definitely, from our end, as independent analysts, we say the federal government needs to be careful and cut its quotes according to its size. Otherwise, we are heading gradually towards the path of debt unsustainability, and this would become a significant concern for fiscal policy and even for investors who want to fund infrastructure projects within the country in the nearest future.
Ayorinde Akinloye is an investment research analyst at United Capital PLC. Thank you so much. Do enjoy the rest of your Monday.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. It's always